Hi, my name is Pano. I am your new host for this new show called Magic the Gathering Tutorials. Now, I know not many of you know about Magic, which is not a bad thing. I will do my best to teach you the ropes and how it works in a simple and easy way. So, the first lesson in our agenda is what is Magic? Magic is basically like a card game similar to like Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's less about Yu-Gi-Oh particularly. But it uses like fantasy elements and has that very strategic way of thinking. So, the next one would be, what is a deck? A deck is basically the container where you just put your cards in. And these can be from different cards, from forest creatures to angels to demons to many other things. What is rare? Rare is basically a very uncommon specific card that you don't usually will get on your first try. So you would use like rares are pretty great in their own way. They may not be like mythic rares, but they're pretty great. So from a good rare would technically be from like a vampire or some other type of creature. A common creature is basically like your normal creature or specific card. A good example of one would be this cat. It's part of the red deck, which is fire-based, but it's a pretty good one. Another common, would be this other cat. It's pretty good. So those are the basic common ones. The next one would be a mythic rare. Mythic rares technically deal with like legendaries, like creatures from legendary dragons to angels to other stuff. So like this would be a mythic rare. This would also be a mythic rare. These are all legendaries. And yeah. A combat. What is a combat phase? A combat phase is basically a phase where you and your opponent duke it out in one big fight. Where, if let's say you and your opponent had a powerful, if your opponent had like a specific human mage, and you had like an angel that had like a 5 and 5, well, you would then need to initiate combat. So that would basically mean that you would allow your angel to attack your opponent's human mage, which that just deals with like combat, nothing too special. But yeah. So the turn order deals with like your starting phase. So like by you drawing like a specific card, like any of these cards on this desk. And basically, you want to also see in your main phase, you want to be able to see if you have any mana to spare. And if you have, then you'll be able to summon any type of creatures or sorceries or artifacts. And if you're done with that, you have an end phase where you end your turn and your opponent goes and does the same thing that you did, which is nice. Mana is what you use for the card. So there's lands that deal with mana, and there's like some other creatures and sorcery cards that have mana in them, and you want to be able to have like the specific number of that mana for you to use that card. Toughness. Toughness is basically your creature's health. So like a good example would be, all right. So a good example would be this card has 4 toughness, which is its health. So if the 4 is turns into a 0, then it's obviously dead. So you wouldn't be able to use this card anymore. What is power? All right, so power is basically your creature's strength. So like the strength is 2. So if it's not strong enough, it probably won't survive in a battle. If the power is less than what your opponent brings. So what is a tapped creature? All right. So a tapped creature. So let's say if I was in a battle, this creature right here would obviously untapped creature. Well, an untapped creature would be like this. So a tapped creature would be like if you were doing a combat phase, and a tapped creature would just be like this. So what is a sorcery? Sorcery is basically, I don't know if I have it here. All right, here. Sorcery are basically spell cards. Spell cards can be used whenever you want, but there comes a cost where you won't be able to use that sorcery card unless you don't have enough mana to use it for, which is acceptable. What is an artifact? Artifacts are used for like advantages. So like Boros Signet. You want to be able to use artifacts for like strengthening creatures and stuff like that. Lands are kind of like these. It depends on the lands you choose, because like there are tons. So like if you have red cards, you're probably not going to use white cards, even though those probably aren't going to be the ones that you want to summon in like the battlefield. So like there are times where lands are combined, so like, you can have like creatures that use like red lands and white lands. So there are a set somewhat, but it's not always the case. But there are exceptions. Planewalkers. Planewalkers are similar to that of like the main characters of like all the creatures. They're like, you could kind of see that they're kind of like adventurers that traverse in universes, but they're not exactly from that same universe, but they try and travel to see, um, if there are like any powerful foes out there that would be willing to challenge them. There are specific comics about them, but I'm probably not going to get to it right now. But how does combat work? All right, so how combat works is kind of like this. Let's say, all right, say I have, say I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lands, and I have Lyria, the Dawnbringer, as well as Light of Legion. And okay, so my creature is, say my creature isn't exactly tapped, or yeah, if the creature isn't tapped, and my Light of Legion basically tries to direct attack Lyria Dawnbringer. That would technically mean that both Lyria and the Light of Legion would both die in the battlefield, allowing them to go into like the graveyard. So like the graveyard is like where all your creatures go if they die. But yeah, that's usually how combat would basically work. And there are times where you'll be able to block, but that's usually the same as like the combat phase. But all right, how's the main phase work? Well, the main phase is basically, let's say this was my deck. I would draw a card, draw 7. You would technically start with 7 cards overall, but yeah, you want to place a land on the battlefield, and if you don't have any lands that actually are able to like summon creatures or specific spell cards, then you're probably just gonna pass your turn. All right, upkeep. So an upkeep step is basically like you kind of beginning your phase. It's kind of like the main phase, but it's not too different. A cleanup step is basically when you're actually nearing your turn, you want to be able to discard any types of cards that may be more than 7 cards in your hand. So that also deals with like the cleanup step. What does a mana cost? Mana costs are basically specific. So like this one, the vampire, has 2 black. Once you have 2 black, you'll be able to summon this. That's what the mana cost is. What is an enchantment? Enchantments are similar to like spell cards, so a good enchantment would basically be Verity Circle. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it hasn't been declared as an attacker, you may draw a card. It's basically what it's saying. It's kind of like a cheat card, where if your opponent doesn't attack on that specific turn, you get to draw as many cards as you may wish. I mean, as long as it's your turn, though. But enchantments are basically similar to like sorcerer cards. They're basically spell cards. Instances are, it's in the name. Instances basically are cast instantly. So as long as it's your turn, you'll be able to cast an instance whenever you want, as long as you have mana. If you do not have mana, you will not be able to cast any type of card in your deck. How do you cast spells? What are spells? Alright, so how do you cast spells is pretty neat. So let's say I have, I'll take a guess. Let's say we have 3 mana. And we cast Verity Circle. With Verity Circle, you'll be able to also draw a card if your opponent does not declare an attack on you specifically. As long as they haven't declared an attack, you're fine. But if they do, hopefully, it won't be as much damage. But how do you counter? Now, what's nice about this is, oh jeez, countering is pretty simple. So like, let's put Light of Legion as an example. Whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. So like, it has 1. So this wouldn't be a 5 and 5, but a 6 and 6. So that's good. What are creatures? Creatures are basically specific. It can be for monsters or angels. You can summon these on the field so they can help you block or declare attacks on your on their position. Summoning Sickness is a phase where creatures aren't necessarily allowed to attack or do anything until your next turn, which is nice. What is life? Life is basically your health. Without life, you are basically dead. And that's about it for our tutorial. Stay tuned for next time.